I would suggest that we start. As you know, for today and for next time, we have essentially the so-called conflict cycle to be studied. You remember that in the first class, we essentially introduced the kind of basic concepts of diplomacy. You could call it the language of diplomacy, the words of diplomacy, from different angles. In the second lecture, we gave kind of a bird's eye view about how this world looks like. A somewhat messy world, a world with, as I said, a lot of uncertainty and unpredictability, with different powers emerging and looking for an equilibrium, the most important ones being China, which is definitely emerging, but more economically than politically. The new Russia, with a strong leader like Putin, who kind of wanted to rectify whatever happened in the Yeltsin years, and where perhaps the West has been abusing a little bit of the new situation. A European Union that still was looking for its own identity in terms of, yes, we had the Maastricht Treaty, but then again, we didn't really fully exploit the potential of that treaty. And then, of course, you have the US, which, as I said, have been a strong power for many years, by and large a responsible power, but which have retreating a little bit. And everybody is talking about the isolationism of Mr. Trump, but as I said, in fact, that tendency, that trend, was already visible at the time of President Obama. So that gave us a global view of the situation, and we looked basically at the great powers. Now we are going to look at what I would call the small players, because conflicts today are small conflicts. It's not interstate war, it's rather intra-state war. And the conflict cycle, just to recall, that's where the conflict breaks loose, and that's what basically we call war, sometimes armed conflict. The distinction is a very difficult one to establish, although some scholars have put figures. Well, you somewhere need a criterion to decide what is a armed conflict versus a war. And the criterion that you sometimes read, but don't give it a lot of importance, that is that an armed conflict is something like 25 victims, dead victims, and here a war is of the order of 1,000. That is the distinction that some people make. I don't pay any attention to that, because the whole question is, what do you do with all those people in between the 25 and the 1,000? It's like the 0.7% development cooperation. That's a target, it's an aspiration. It has become a symbolic figure. You may know what the origin of the 0.7 is. It is a footnote in a book written by the economist Tinbergen in the 30s, I think, when he was for the first time propagating the theories of integration, economic and political integration. There was a footnote somewhere that mentioned 0.7, just to tell you the kind of arbitrary character of the thing. The same is a little bit true with the so-called 2% of the NATO, investment requirement. NATO requires or invites its allies to contribute 2% of their gross national product to defense. We are not there at all. Some countries are there, of course, countries like the US in the first place. A partner like Greece has a very strong defense budget and also comes to the figure, but most of them are wavering around 1 to 1.3%. Again, there is nothing sacrosanct of that 2%, all the more that the efficiency of your military machinery is much more dependent on other factors than just the numerical factor of what money you put in personnel, in machinery and so on. Coordination, cohesion and that kind of thing are much more important. So the same is true for this. But now, when we start here and we end up there, and here we have the open conflict. Now, where do you start? Well, you start with a low intensity conflict. As a matter of fact, we better speak about a dispute. That is where everything starts. A dispute is simply a very low intensity conflict. That dispute then escalates, very often step by step, by the non-appropriate conduct of either party, the one or the other, or perhaps both. And then it escalates, the dispute becomes indeed a low-level, low-intensity conflict. It degrades, it becomes critical, it's the last-minute moment. And then we go for the hypothesis that there is not a final kind of settlement or agreement, whatever, and we get into the war. Once, and this we skip for today, because next week, as you know, we are going to focus on that single moment, which is of course a very critical moment, and that is why it deserves a lecture on its own with two big questions. That is the legality of a war, that is just the fact that you start using force is itself a very difficult question. It's what the lawyers call jus ad bellum, the right to fight. And there is a whole doctrine, a rather clear-cut, meaningful, and I find rather intelligent doctrine about when are you entitled to start using force. And then that is the jus ad bellum, the right to fight. And then you have the jus in bello. And the jus in bello, that's an ablative, a Latin ablative. That's the rules you have to respect once you are fighting. And that is what in older times we called the law of war, the war laws, the Geneva Conventions, the Hague Conventions for the lawyers among you, what today we call a humanitarian law. So this we will see next week. So then the conflict is over. Somehow everybody is weirded out, or there is a victor and a victim, whatever. But in any case, a peace settlement needs to come down. And you don't get that from one day to another. As a matter of fact, again, a lot of distinctions can be introduced. Very often, here, you have something called a ceasefire. A ceasefire is an extremely precarious thing. It doesn't commit the parties. What it basically means very often is that the two sides, very often because they are weirded out, just say, let's calm down for a weekend, or it's Christmas, let people give some relief. That's the kind, ceasefire doesn't mean anything. In fact, you can't break a ceasefire. Yes, in the facts you can break it in terms of you restart engaging in your activities, but you can't break it in terms of you have not legally committed yourself to anything. But it's the beginning of something. It's the beginning of the end of the continuous war or the continuous armed conflict. And from a ceasefire, then you can go to a situation where you have what they call a cessation of hostilities. That's already something much more serious. That's already engaging the parties, cessation of hostilities. And then, of course, what you really need at the end of the war is a peace agreement. a peace accord. Now, I just mentioned that we won't come back to that. These are nice distinctions which in practice very often are put together, particularly the kind of ceasefire thing and the cessation of hostilities thing. But then we come in the stage where we have to build the peace building, the state building, because everything has been, well, if not destroyed materially, at least politically, everything is down. And that is what we call the peace building, the state building stage, with at the very end reconstruction and rehabilitation. We have some reconciliation here, but we come back to all that. Now, before going through that cycle, in that sense, I wanted to say a few things about the conflicts today. We spoke about the Cold War. That was indeed not a hot war, because not a single shot has been shot. Well, perhaps in the periphery a few, but basically this was a Cold War. And that was potentially something that would have happened between two big states, the Soviet Union on the one hand and the United States on the other hand, and all its allies, because you remember the little picture I gave you. At the time of the Cold War, we lived in a bipolar world, and everybody knew exactly its place. So either you was in this camp or you were in the other camp. Today we have definitely the nature of the conflicts have changed. As a matter of fact, we today don't have interstate wars going on. We didn't have, as a matter of fact, much interstate wars as of the end of the Cold War. One of them was the first Gulf War, where Kuwait invaded, where Iraq invaded Kuwait. This was a classical interstate war. But what we see today is that there has been a transition from interstate wars to intrastate wars. So it's wars within the state. And that is linked, as I told you, to the end of the bipolarity. We said that last time. As a result of the bipolarity of the world disappearing, the lid which was let on many countries disappeared, and therefore the forces that had been suppressed under that kind of discipline came loose. And we have seen that, for instance, the Balkans is a very good example of what happened in the former Yugoslavia as a result of that lid being taken over. But we have seen that in other places, for instance, in many countries which issued out of the former Soviet Union, where there were very often ethnic tensions. Again, these tensions arose. For instance, one example is Georgia, where there has been a very nasty opposition between the Abkhaz and the Georgians. And we may come back to that because it is an example about how you tried out preventive diplomacy and that kind of things. So the first thing to note is from inter to intrastate conflicts. The second thing to note is paradoxically that although, as I told you, most people, most observers agree that the world today is a less dangerous place than what it was under the Cold War, still, today there are more conflicts than there were at the time of the Cold War. But that is naturally, of course, directly linked to the fact that these are intrastate wars. Intrastate, ethnic, religious wars and that kind of things, of all kinds. And the number of intrastate conflicts is much higher than that of interstate wars. And that explains also why the number of conflicts has gone up very much. In general, people deem that there are about 90% of the conflicts around in the whole period from 45 up to now. Another thing that is linked to that kind of change in the field of conflicts, the type of conflicts, the nature of conflicts, is the intensity of conflicts. A war is a war, and most wars are just all-out wars. There is no something like half a war. These conflicts, as you already see from these figures, can be very variable in terms of intensity. It can go from low intensity to high intensity, from what we call simmering conflicts to manifest conflicts. So all these are new distinctions. Now, number of wars, nature of wars, intra, intensity of wars. But then we have also to look at the ends for which, the objectives for which people are fighting, which is also linked to the causes because of what they fight. Now, the transition from inter to intra already says you something. The causes are not the old kind of war type of conflicts, were what we call the secular conflicts, where essentially it was a conflict of power on territory, just expansion of your territory, just making sure that you are the overwhelming power, overwhelming the others. That basically, if you look at the First World War, the Second World War, war was essentially something that states did with other states in order to increase their power, their outreach, their territory, sometimes securing resources, but that is the old style war. The new style conflicts, the intrastate conflicts, are much more around factors like religion and ethnicity. And that is why most of the wars we see today are in fact wars about ethnic identity and religious identities. Religious identities, I don't have to be very explicit on that. You have the Arabs and the non-Arabs, such as the Iranians. Within the Arabs, you have the Sunni and the Shia. But then again, within the Shia, you have the classical Shias, and for instance, as in Lebanon, the Druze from Jumblat. So you have all kinds of religious identities that are much more articulate today than you had in the past. Religious identities and, as I said, ethnic identities. You have, of course, the Christians versus the Muslims in the first place. Within the Muslims, the distinctions I already made. And this kind of new, we see that everywhere. Well, I already mentioned Lebanon. If you look at the other ongoing conflicts today, like Yemen, essentially it's again a question of ethnicity. Myanmar is a question of ethnicity. The Philippines, it's a question of secessionists, but also, in this case, religion. Philippines, as you know, is a Catholic country. It's a former Spanish colony, and that is what explains the Catholicism there. But in the southern part, there is a Muslim community that is fighting the state authorities. So you almost always come back to ethnicity or religion. But as I said, so the ends for which you are fighting are quite different from the old style wars. But the causes which are at the foundation of why you go to a conflict are also very different. Of course, they are what I said, religion and ethnicity, but there are also factors like triggering factors like poverty, inequality, lack of resources, warlords, crime gangs, drugs, identity, I spoke about that. So it's quite different. And it is that kind of diversity of causes that makes some people speak increasingly also of the concept of human security. But I come back to that. In a certain sense, conflicts, and we are not yet here, we just are making some preliminary remarks about the typology of conflicts today. It's because of that diversity at causes and the diversity, therefore, of what you are fighting for, because your cause very often explains what you are fighting for. If, for instance, in Rwanda, the genocide most probably would not have happened if there wasn't scarcity of resources. The scarcity of resources would probably not have happened if there was not a demographic pressure so high. The demographic pressure itself can go back to elements of underdevelopment and that kind of things. In addition on that, I'm just trying to find out a little bit of causes. Demographic pressures, resource, scarcity of land resources. On that you have then an ethnic factor, the Hutus and the Tutsis. And all this makes for the right recipe for having an all-out genocidal conflict, in that case, as you remember, in April '94. So the causes are different, the ends for which you are fighting, and since these causes and ends are much closer to the person you are, because when you speak about my identity, an ethnic identity, that is, am I Hutu or Tutsi, which is quite a difference. I lived in Burundi for some time, where you have exactly the same. You have a third identity there, Twa, but that's a very small minority. Your identity as an ethnicity, your identity in terms of religion. We are relatively secular societies here in Western Europe, but over there, religion is part of their identity. So what you see is that those elements for which you fight are in fact existential factors. And that brings security much closer to the human you are. It's not the abstract state, it's not Bismarck who decides to fight France. It's not Napoleon who says, I want to build an empire. That's Napoleon, that's Bismarck, that's the state. It's much more people who care for their identities. And because of that existential dimension, we start speaking about human security. And later I will say something on that, or I can say it as one. Human security is mainly looking at security problems, not as a kind of, something that happened out of the blue, they started fighting and that kind of things. It's really looking at the humans behind the conflict and trying to address what they call the root causes, the underlying reasons why that conflict started in the first place. And that's, of course, a kind of in-depth approach that is much more difficult than just bringing the people to a table, like they did in Versailles, an unfair agreement, an unfair treaty, as you know, but you bring the big players, Clemenceau with a big moustache and others together, they negotiated, an unfair negotiation, let's be sure, because the Second War is a direct result of a bad deal in Versailles. But this was, the big diplomats, the big chefs, the big presidents, and so on. Whereas human security is something of bringing these people really together and trying to bring them over the bridge and make peace and make them understand that a peace is a much more valuable asset than conflict. And that is basically what human security is, addressing the root causes, but it's also much more difficult. It's not just sitting here at a negotiation table in Paris or Versailles and making the deal. It's really a work of long term that makes sure that people are really reconciled, and that on that reconciliation you can build a new nation, a new state. What else do I have to tell you? Yeah, the definition of victory is also different. When in the kind of classical old war style conflicts, take the First War, you have an outright conflict, very precarious, takes 4 years, what means that the equivalence of the powers was much more or less, they were fighting with each other with perhaps the same capabilities, otherwise he would have lasted for that long. But basically it ends up with a victor and a victim. That's it. You crush the other, you neutralize him, and the war is over. And that's the kind of definition of a victory. I crushed the other. Today, the definition of a victory is not just from merely neutralizing and conquering the enemy, but it moved towards the establishment of a more comprehensive security environment. So the kind of in-depth thing I was talking about. Not just crushing the enemy, also making sure that you build a peace for the people. And sometimes they call the victor-victim logic negative peace. You get a peace, a little bit like Versailles, but this was a negative peace. That is, the hostilities are over, therefore it's peace. That's also what Bush thought when he did his the junior Bush, with the second Gulf War. He came in militarily. He did not address any question about what after the war, because as you know, then the real problem started. Building peace is much more difficult than fighting a war. But you fight a war and you said, it's over, they are crushed. That is what we now start calling negative peace. The positive peace is the one, look, it's now that the real problem starts. We have to build a peace, a positive peace, which is a peace where people find themselves again. So you see, a lot of things to be thought on. And again, what I'm saying here is not, these are not ukases, and I don't pretend that everything I say is right, but I just want to show you a little bit the complexity of how to look at conflicts, the causes, the ends, a victim and a victor, the nature, intrastate, the number of conflict, the intensity, simmering, low intensity, high intensity, and so on. Now, let's start with the cycle as such. You could basically say that this whole part of the cycle is conflict prevention. You try to prevent the conflict. And this one is basically conflict management. You manage your conflict and you try to work towards state building, peace building, state stability, and that kind of things. Now, let's start with, so that's the preventive side and that's the management side. Let's see first what you can do in terms of prevention. Now, although all this I call prevention, part of the cycle, there is something specific here which is being called preventive diplomacy. And for that I would like briefly to go back to something that happened in the United Nations in '92. At that time the Secretary General was Boutros Ghali, the Egyptian one. He started sometime like 89, 90 with his mandate, and in '92 he issued what we call the Agenda for Peace. And that was a rather interesting document. If you can Google it and have a look at it, it's rather interesting, because Boutros Ghali wanted to put some clarity in the messy, concepts that were floating around. And in his Agenda for Peace of '92, what he essentially tried to do is make some distinctions which are useful for our discussion as well. Although, again, I will put them in the periphery here because they are not key to the cycle itself, but they are part of the story. He said there are different ways of approaching a conflict, and he made the distinction between peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building. These are terms which are quite familiar to many people: peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building. And you could put peace enforcement here in between, but I skip that. Peacemaking is essentially the following. The UN has been doing that in the very beginning of its existence, but it doesn't do it very often today. Peacemaking is really having UN troops being sent to a place and to make peace. That is really to say, you are now going to be separated and so on. You should remember, for those of you who are interested, look at the UN Charter, which is, you read that in 1 hour about. There is a whole chapter about the setup of military forces of the UN itself. So the idea in 1945 was that the UN would have its own kind of army. Of course, it would not be a standing army in the building at the First Avenue in New York City, Manhattan. It would be a standing army in terms of elements of different armies, contributing forces that could be callable, that could be called into whenever necessary. That was the idea. And therefore, peacemaking in the beginning was really the idea. The idea of the UN was, we are going to make UN, we will make the peace. Today, as you know, the peace is being made essentially by a coalition. A coalition, as we say, a coalition of the willing. Able and willing. Are you able to bring forces to the fore? Are you willing to be part of that coalition? For instance, the Gulf War was with the coalition both 1 and 2. The second one, as you remember, was a rather narrow coalition because most of us thought that was the wrong war. It's only basically, well, apart from the US, it's UK with Mr. Blair, and I think he regrets his decision at the time, and Portugal, quite remarkably. Whereas the first coalition, the first Gulf War with Father Bush, which was a totally legitimate war, it had the consent of the Security Council, was a much broader coalition. So peacemaking in the beginning was something that the UN thought we will do that ourselves. To date, it's coalitions who do it. An example is Korea. In 1951, there was a UN force being sent, UN as such, and we didn't speak about peacekeeping at the time. That was really peacemaking, which is sometimes called today peace enforcement. We enforce the peace. Peacekeeping, that you know, peacekeeping is essentially the sending of a force once some kind of peace has been reached. As people in New York say, how do you want me to keep the peace when there isn't the peace in the first place? So peacekeeping today essentially comes here. Once the hostilities, the outright hostilities are over, you send a peacekeeping operation, PKO. And as you know, the UN has been sending dozens and dozens of those PKO operations all over the world. That's peacekeeping. Peace enforcement would be rather somewhere here, you know? People start the hostilities and the peacemaker comes in. But today that's almost excluded, except for coalitions. For instance, the coalition of the first Gulf War was a coalition that came in at the very time when the war was going on between Iraq and Kuwait. That's peacekeeping, and peace building then is here. Peace building is essentially here. That is, the peace has been reached in a formal or an informal understanding, the beginning of some political settlement, perhaps a provisional constitution and so on, and then you build the peace. And that peace building approach is a very comprehensive approach, and for your information, it is only in 2000 at the so-called Millennium Summit in the United Nations, 2005, the Millennium Summit of the United Nations set up the Mdgs. That you remember? Mdgs. We now have in 2015, we made a review of the Mdgs, a review, so 2015, review Mdgs, and we called them the Sustainable Development Goals. they were transmuted in sustainable goals. By the way, this was quite a success. Reviewing the Mdgs after 15 years was quite a success in terms of, yes, a lot of progress had been made. And that is indeed linked also to human security, and that is linked to peace building and that kind of things. Now, so Boutros Ghali made that distinction. Peacemaking, peace enforcement, peacekeeping, peace building, and then he added something, and that is what I briefly will say now, is he added the concept of preventive diplomacy. He says, look, instead of trying to solve problems once they have been created, let's try to avoid the problem arise in the first place. Let's try to prevent conflicts. And everybody was very enthusiastic about the concept. Really, it was, if you wanted to be a trendy diplomat, you had always to speak about preventive diplomacy and what have you, which, however, underestimated the difficulty of the problem, because essentially what the preventive diplomacy forgot is that in order to really prevent a conflict, you need the necessary political will to address that problem. Now, last week we spoke about short-term and long-term, and we said that generally one of the problems that where diplomacy has sometimes, problems, that is that a lot of politicians think essentially in short-term terms. They just look at the short term and they don't look at the long term. So although we sometimes see the signals coming to us, take Kosovo. What happened in Kosovo, in the conflictual relation, the rivalry between Serbia and Kosovo. Kosovo, which was constitutionally a province, a mere province of Serbia, so the legitimacy, the legality was on the side of Milosevic, but the way he handled the conflict was not acceptable from a humanitarian point of view. That Kosovo crisis, we saw it come. I saw it come. Many of my colleagues, my friends in Belgium, in France, everywhere, we saw that come closer and closer. And we knew it would erupt one day, and still we did not act. And the question then you have to ask, how come, my God, we see this come to us and we don't do anything? I think that is essentially due to the fact that a politician is a political animal. He has to be re-elected next time, and he says, look, I only solve a problem when the problem is there, and I will never and perhaps he is right, I will never convince my population, my electorate, those guys who have to re-elect me next time, that I now have to spend resources, that I now have to send my military to a place where there is no open conflict yet, because that's the whole point of preventing a conflict. That is, go into it when it is simmering and making sure that you try to avoid. So I think there is a kind of what you could call intrinsic contradiction in the term preventive diplomacy. Diplomacy is always remedial, if I may say so, and not essentially preventive. This is a factual criticism. It's not a normative criticism. Of course, we all would like preventive diplomacy to be something that works, including for the politicians with their short-term kind of view. But the facts and the reality is that it does not often work. Take Lebanon, for instance, today. We see how the rivalry between Iran, and today, I mean really today, how the rivalry between Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other hand is playing out on the scene of Lebanon, where, as you know, Saad Hariri, the prime minister, kind of left the country, fled the country, and is in Saudi Arabia. where he kind of stays, lives, is taken hostage. Nobody knows exactly. But what we know for sure is that this is a dispute here, a real dispute between Saudi Arabia and Iran, a dispute that is already conflictually playing out in Yemen with the Houthi, who are being supported by Iran, and the Saudis, who support the so-called official authorities, and that could now be playing out again in Lebanon. You know that Lebanon has always been the scene of proxy wars. The Israeli invade on one hand, the Syrians come in on the other hand. Lebanon is really an orphan, I would say, as far as the conflicts. It's almost an example. You could illustrate the whole lessons, a series of lectures of conflicts, just taking the example of Lebanon. I already mentioned Lebanon as far as religious entities is concerned. I just mentioned the Sunni and the Shia and the Druses, but within the Christian, which is then the other side, because all these are Muslims, in the Christian side, you have all kind of Christians. I lived there for some time. I discovered the whole panoply of Christianity. You have Orthodox Christians, you have Egyptian Coptic Christians, you have the classical Catholic Christians, and you have the Protestants, well, the ones we know here in the western part of Europe. So it's a very vulnerable country, it's a magnificent country, and it's a scandal, I think, if I may permit that personal note, that conflicts between bigger powers, pivotal powers, as we call them, when a power is intermediate, is not like Russia and the US, but is intermediate, we call it a pivotal power. Saudi Arabia is a pivotal power, Iran is a pivotal power, Egypt is. That they just played out on the filth of their neighbor, that's not very clean, to say the least. All right, so I introduced this concept, and preventive diplomacy is something that should come in here, but as I told you, there are limitations in that. All right, I leave it at that because otherwise our time is going to be run out. We are not very far in the cycle yet, but let's take that. Well, we don't need to say much on the time. It's logic itself. So here we have preventive diplomacy in the sense that I said you come in an early stage and make sure that the parties can agree. You do that through diplomacy, through talking. The instruments you have is negotiation, mediation, good offices. Perhaps I come back to that at the end of the lecture today. There are different techniques for bringing disputing parties together, with or with their consent. But all of these techniques are peaceful means to address your conflict. And as a matter of fact, the UN Charter provides for different mechanisms in Chapter 6. The big difference between Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 is that Chapter 7 is the one that allows you to use force. Chapter 6 is the one that allows you to help parties out in their disputes / conflicts. I spoke about Boutros Ghali, right? Not to be too negative about preventive diplomacy, sometimes it does work. And if you take a book of preventive diplomacy, you will find all kinds of examples. But an example that is very often given is Macedonia. You know that the fighting has been taking place in the former Republic of Yugoslavia, almost in all places except Slovenia, because Slovenia was, for all practical purposes, most people consider it to be an annex of Austria or something like that, and they didn't want to take the trouble to be fighting for Slovenia in the north. But all others, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, have been involved in that conflictual situation, Kosovo as part of Serbia. And Macedonia is one of the places where all the conflict stuff was present. All the ingredients for what we saw, particularly in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where you had three communities, the Bosniaks, the Croats, and the Serbs, three distinct ethnic identities. Just to come back to what I told you earlier, all the ingredients of conflict were there. And I think it is fair to say that it is thanks to a sustained effort in preventive diplomacy, with different organizations coming in, the European Union, the OSCE, NATO, all work together. NATO, it was a time that Mr. Robertson was the Secretary General. Javier Solana, for the Europeans, some of you may have heard his name. He was the kind of predecessor of Ashton Mogherini today in the External Action Service. They worked very well together to avoid a conflict in Macedonia in the late 90s and the beginning of 2001 in what they call the Ohrid agreement. So that was an example of preventive diplomacy. Then we go to the second stage. We come closer to the conflict. We come to the stage that we would call deterrence. Deterrence is really just starting to give signals that people have to behave properly, that you have enough of it, that if they don't behave properly, then you may threaten with the use of force. You threaten with the use of force, but perhaps prior to that, you will bring on the fore coercive means. Coercive means are allowed, to some extent, to be used. Again, normally you need the agreement of the Security Council, but coercive means, for instance, is a sanctions regime, the freezing of assets of some people who don't behave properly. That's one way. You can also start with soft measures like the non-granting of visa anymore to the people of the country that you are addressing. These are coercive means that can use in order to bring a country back into the fold. And that's what we also call sometimes coercive diplomacy, aimed at preventing and avoiding conflict by successfully threatening with the use of force. That is what happened basically in quite a lot of conflicts, such as, for instance, both the First and the Second Gulf War, to which I already referred. Normally, what you see in that stage, and we are more or less here now, what you see in that stage is that there is an ultimate attempt to stop the low intensity conflict deteriorating to a high intensity one. And you do that essentially by sending out two messages. The first one is you send out the message that you want to generally try to end the conflict by making proposals. That is, for instance, what happened in the first Gulf War when James Baker, he was the guy in charge at the State Department at the time, we are talking about 91, James Baker went to see Tarek Aziz, who was his counterpart in Iraq, and he basically said, look, this is a last diplomatic opening I make to avoid a war. I show my willingness to stop that war, but it's your last chance to take it. That is one message, a genuine message of let's try and fix it. But at the same time, there is another message in the same package. If you don't go for that, then you should know the only alternative remaining is war. And we have seen that very clear in the first Gulf War with the dialogue James Baker, Tariq Aziz. We have seen that in the second, in the Kosovo War in '99, we've seen exactly the same, and now it was Albright who was in charge in Washington, and Milosevic who was in charge in Serbia, in Belgrado, and there was a conference, some of you may recall that, there was the conference of Rambouillet in France. That was a kind of, again, last chance conference with a double message. We have here a proposal, which was a rather good proposal. If you look on the merits of the case, this is a proposal, Milosevic, buy it. There won't be an open conflict. Kosovo remains a legitimate part of Serbia, but you withdraw your troops, we bring in humanitarian aid, it becomes a no-fly zone or something like that, and this can be a deal. If not, please note that there will be an intervention on our side, the famous NATO intervention in Kosovo, then later extended to Belgrado, which was a so-called humanitarian intervention in order to spare the lives and well-being of the Kosovar population. And that is where indeed we ended up with the so-called NATO intervention in Kosovo in '99. So you see that scenario, that double kind of message always recurring, the kind of, last chance in some. I make you an offer. What we negotiate, Rambouillet was not just telling them, you take it or you leave. No, this was a negotiation where a lot of points were being made. But at the same time, you signal, if this negotiation doesn't end with an agreement, then the alternative will be war. And just a little anecdote. In Rambouillet, as I told you, you had Albright there, and the councillors of Albright said, Madeleine, go home. This conference in Rambouillet will never result in anything meaningful. You're just losing your time. That conference that took days and days. You're losing your time. Go back to Washington, and there are more useful things to be done in Washington. And she said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stay. Because she wanted to make sure that this second message was as clear as well. If she would have left, people could have said, but she wasn't there. That was no negotiation anymore. She left it just to their, Assistant Secretary of State, Deputy Secretary of State. Whereas she said, I have to stay here. They must know that by my staying here and by my utterly losing my time, but the others see also that I'm losing my time because they are not willing to join us in a proper agreement, a balanced agreement. So they know then that the alternative is credible. Should she not have been there and go back to Washington, the credibility of that message would have been less prominent. So I want to stress that. I've been repeating myself a couple of times, but I want to stress that you have always that kind of bifurcation in the messages you leave. So that was Kosovo. And then, then we are close to the conflict. We are always closing in to the real conflict. And then you have what some people call pre-conflict diplomacy. As a matter of fact, it's almost no diplomacy anymore. We are here, high intensity. It's not yet open-ended conflict, but high intensity dispute. We are basically here. The decision to go to war has been taken after the two options were being made. And the role of a diplomat there is no longer let's make an effort, an additional effort. The role of the diplomat then is prepare the field for the military, because it's no diplomatic affair anymore. As of today, it's a question for the military. They will have to come into the conflict. But still a diplomat has a role in terms of what you could call preparing the diplomatic side of the conflict. That is supporting the military and making sure that the war can be as short as possible, as clean, as neat as possible. And that is basically what we had to do. Think about the invasion of Afghanistan, for instance, after 9/11, of course, in October 2001. What the diplomats essentially had to do, they were still negotiating, but not negotiating peace, negotiating the logistics of what the military had to do, such as, and that should not be underestimated, such as, for instance, securing transit rights, overflight rights, all the military material. I'm talking, for instance, the example I give now is Afghanistan. All that military material had to be flown over to Afghanistan. A lot of that military material was located in Western Europe, and it had to be flown. And then the question was, do I get clearances from the Central Asian countries in order to transit there, make a base there of my material, and send it then through to Afghanistan at the right moment. Another job of the diplomats in that stage is to build your coalition. Diplomats are going all over the place, talking with a lot of people and saying, join us in this coalition. This is important. Some of you may recall that for the Afghanistan conflict, Article 5 of the NATO alliance, the NATO, was activated for the first time in the history of NATO. Now, think about it. We have all that period of the Cold War with the Warsaw Pact on the side of the Soviet Union, with the NATO alliance on the side of the, Western Europe, US alliance, and never has Article 5 been activated. And then we are so much later in time, 2001, 9/11, and Article 5 is activated at the request of President Bush. If you ask me, but again, this is a personal opinion, I found that personally an abuse of the NATO Washington Treaty. But that was just to, what I would call on behalf of, on the side of the Americans, to kind of inflate the issue. You remember that Bush at that time spoke about a war on terrorism, and you say, this is the war on terrorism. Javier Solana, the same day, used another qualification of where we were. And I just will recall that because I find that very interesting, how a different qualification shows how differently we looked at what had happened. War on terror, political catastrophe. You see, Javier Solana, the Hispanophone, una catastrofa politica. So it's a totally different kind of political qualification, and that's the way we in Western Europe felt it. And I, for one, for instance, that's why I'm talking about the abuse of Article 5. This was terrible. It was a political catastrophe, but not a war on terrorism. But okay, that's just, again, a personal note. So, we are here. The last measures have been taken. Diplomacy, the diplomat goes home, and we enter the conflict. And as I told you, entering the conflict, that is something that we are going to do next week. Now we get at once to the post-conflict side. the peace building side, the peace management side, the conflict management. The conflict has to be managed. And we have, again, different stages. But, of course, you understand that when I'm talking about stages, this is just to make it conceptually somewhat neat. The reality is that this is an extremely messy situation all the time. Whereas here, to some extent, you can distinguish stages in the conflict building. It's very difficult to have clear, neat stages in the peace building. But for conceptual reasons, let's make some of those distinctions. The first thing you do when a conflict ends here is security. And that's very important because some people at once here, you have eager diplomats who at once start talking about reconstruction, rehabilitation. So they are thinking about, yeah, but that bridge has to be rebuilt, and that hospital and those schools and so on, which clearly is something that just comes later. Not that it is not a priority for those little kids to go to school and what have you. It's because without securing your situation on the ground in the first place, all this is just lost energy. It doesn't make any sense. The first thing is security first. The first thing to be done once the war is over is to establish a secure environment, and that means separating the warring groups. Just separate them physically. First thing to be done. Second is disarmament. Take the weapons away. This is definitely no joke, but many conflicts endure, or sometimes there is a relapse in conflict simply because the weapons have not been taken away. They just circulate. You know, a war situation is a terribly cynical enterprise. You are in one camp, you have the arms, you kind of lost, or you were in the middle of that crisis. You just sell your stuff to the next one, and the next one will be the best armed, will again start conflicting with the other one. So it's an important thing to separate the troops, if I may say so, but no less to disarm them. And we speak very often in diplomatic terms, we speak about DDR. Disarmament, demobilization, reintegration. Disarmament comes here, demobilization comes there, reconstruction, reinsertion in society comes there. But the DDR is one thing. I already spoke about the distinctions to be made between ceasefire, cessation of hostilities, and peace agreement. I don't come back to that. UNPKO, and that's the reason I gave you those elements. UNPKO comes here. Once there is kind of a minimal security, but still a lot of potential of relapse, then the UN people start sending peacekeepers, because some kind of peace has been established, and they try to maintain the peace. Then after that kind of stage, the security stage, you start not yet reconstruction and rebuilding, because your base is not yet secured in political terms this time. This was security. Now we go to the political. You need the minimum kind of political settlement, the minimum kind of agreement. I'm not yet talking about the new constitution. I'm talking about perhaps an arrangement, a memorandum of understanding, a pre-agreement that allows you to address what I would call the political questions, the political infrastructure, in terms of we, the old rivals, we are in agreement that some kind of solution will have to go along some kind of these and these lines. Perhaps it's already the beginning of an outline of what will then come in the Constitution, because very often you have to work on a new Constitution. Some preliminary elements you have there, and then they can be formalized in a Constitution. But already at this stage, you have very much to think about what kind of state, post-conflict state, will this be? Because as I told you, this ethnic diversity, religious communities and so on, they have to be brought together again. And most probably, you will end up with a formula of a kind of state that is different from this one. Because apparently this state was not in a position to address those conflicting interests of communities, identities, religion and ethnicity and what have you. So you will have to address them, and therefore you will have to think about, will this be a unitary state? Will this be a federal state? Will this be a confederal state? All formulas that have to be viewed as regards the question of what type of state do I want. What is important in that stage as well is that you make sure that you are building something which will last. So don't go at once to a constitution when you are not sure, when you have not secured yourself that there is a buy-in of the former enemies. They must be really convinced that this new formula you're working out in your pre-agreement or in your constitution is a formula that they will continue to adhere to, because they have a buy-in. They have gone through that reconciliation period I was talking about. Reconciliation of the communities. And a lasting solution is one that meets the minimum of everyone while not meeting the maximum asked by someone. That's very important. So everybody has a level of minimal expectations and maximal ambitions. You will make sure that your solution, your political solution, addresses the minimal requirements of all parties, but not necessarily the maximal of any of them. Because if you have a privileged party that get the maximum, then you don't have the deal. The deal must be in the middle of these things. But that's a kind of rule of thumb. With some reflection, you can easily come to that conclusion as well. And that's the stage of peace building. That is, all this is stage of peace building, when then we have also reconstruction and rehabilitation. And reconstruction and rehabilitation, if this was the kind of making sure that the political infrastructure would be okay, that's making sure that the societal, economic, financial infrastructure is being restored.